All right, before I choke on it, let me get a sip of this old Sasquatch coffee real quick. All right, real quick, something new. This next Friday on the YouTube Live, I do like a little live thing every Friday morning, or every the first and third week of each month here on the PWB on the YouTube channel. I'm going to be showing you guys a little bit of, I guess you could say it's artwork, really. In reality, it actually comes from a place called Kathmandu, out there in Cave Junction from Kathy Slavin, I believe it is. Anyway, she was so kind and just kind enough to send me and my wife a couple things that she had made with Bigfoot on it. One of them was a keychain-like thing that I have, another necklace, and some other things. And what I want to do is kind of show off her art a little bit, because you know me, guys, I love to show off and share with you guys anything that I just come across. It's all Bigfooty and awesome. So I will share that with you next Friday. But it's Kathmandu. It is Kathy Slavin, and you can find her. I think over on Etsy, but I'll have everything for you at that point. What I want to do right now is clear my throat, get another sip of coffee, which is probably why I have to clear my throat. But you can't. You can't stop the Squatch coffee. We're going to get into this week's PacWest Bigfoot encounter story. The Yachats River Bigfoot. Family experiences Bigfoot activity around their coastal home. My wife, myself, and our children no longer live around the Yachats area. We live in Depoe Bay now. And just so you know, our move had nothing to do with the experiences with a Bigfoot around our home and property just outside of the town of Yachats, near the Yachats River. But back in the mid-90s, we did. We had some pretty interesting experiences with this thing or animal called Bigfoot on our property. We even experienced it up close. Well, pretty close, that is. Here's what we experienced, and yes, Dave, I might do an interview with you soon. But for now, until I am done with working with the public, here is what I can tell you, and as publicly as possible. Semi-retired and raising kids around Bigfoot. Never, not in a million years did I believe Bigfoot existed, and I've lived in the Pacific Northwest for nearly 40 years now. Even back then, when things started getting a little strange, did I think it was due to some mythical beast of the PacWest? No, not even close. But that is exactly what it was. And now, because my son and I finally saw one, here's where it started and what exactly we saw. I should be retired by now. I was semi-retired at the time of these, well, somewhat scary and crazy events. But I guess you can say I get a little bored and love to stay busy. So I work in the public realm today still. My specialty has always been in tourism, and before I turned 30, I had already developed a pretty decent collection of bed and breakfasts along the Oregon coast that I sold off. That gave me enough money to enjoy some downtime and raise some kids for a bit without leaving the house for work every day. I took older homes and remodeled them, set up a B&B business model for them, and sold them off, with, of course, some consulting and running a bed and breakfast that came with it as well. It was a wonderful time in my life. But still, I kept busy here and there, doing some consulting for business owners within the tourism and industry along the Oregon coast today. My wife, well, she is an artisan, a sculptor in fact. She also believes she saw something one evening on or near the property, but it was my son and me who saw a Bigfoot clear as day down by the river one late morning while fishing. So, enough of the introductions to it. Here's what me and my family experienced outside of Yachats, Oregon. Spring on the Oregon coast is noisy. Like I said, we lived at the time just out of the town of Yachats up the river. Matter of fact, our home was literally within a few score yards of the river itself. The wife and I purchased a run-down old house and had remodeled it inside and out. Eventually we moved in one late and, yes, wet coastal spring. Today there are a few more homes in the area, but back then we were the only one. Spring was beautiful in Yachats, and noisy. At least it was at night from time to time there. The property was literally on the river, and across it was low-lying hills, and to the north, mountains. We could practically smell the salt air, but no ocean view. Just the river, the mountains, and the sky. And, apparently, Bigfoot. It was not too long after we'd moved in that the weird hollering started up, or maybe continued, seeing how we had not lived there long. Personally, I believe across the river was a passage from east to west. They would migrate along. I personally believe they moved between the eastern Cascade Mountain Range and that of the coastal range, depending on the season. So I agree with you, Dave. But hollering began for us one late April. We all heard it. Me, my wife, and our son, and our daughter, ages 9 and 11 at the time. Our daughter is the oldest. Anyways, it was a beautiful evening. I remember it perfectly. The sun was still up, but low enough in the sky to cast the dark shadows we were getting used to, living outside of town in the countryside. Up until then, we lived in town along the coast, up towards Lincoln City, in fact. Anyways, we had decided to barbecue up some hamburgers. The wife and I wanted to set the soon-to-be summer off the right way, I guess. Plus, like I said, the weather was rather mild and a bit warm that day, so why not, we thought. It was after dinner, and we were eating some dessert, when we started hearing someone or something hollering from up the mountainside, or the hillside, opposite the river from us. My daughter seemed very uncomfortable with the sound, and I can't blame her. Many of the vocalizations I've heard of screams and hollering on YouTube recently really does sound spot on. It was as if something or someone crazy was wandering around in the woods up there, just, hollering and yelling at nothing and everything at once. It was really crazy sounding. It would start out as an almost howl, but end in some type of loud moaning-like sound. It did not seem like it was right across the river itself. It did seem pretty far off up the hills, actually. But we could hear it plain as day. The wife and I were looking at each other and wondering what it was. It kept going for nearly 5 or so minutes. Eventually, however, it stopped. It was the beginning of some crazy things we'd experienced for the next several months, including 2 visuals. My wife, the Bigfoot hunter. My wife was a bit more, enthused about the vocalization than I had been at first. I'm not saying she became a Bigfoot hunter or anything like that, but she did bring up the thought that it could be a Bigfoot. I love my wife, and I have to say, sometimes she says the craziest things. It's one of the things I love about her. But I was not buying the Bigfoot thing just yet at the time. That would come a couple weeks later. Once again, we were out in the backyard. That day was a Saturday, I remember. The weather was fair again, only a little cooler that evening, and we decided to start a small campfire-like fire in the backyard and enjoy some family time outside that evening. Besides, we'd worked all day doing some landscaping, and one chore was actually building a simple dugout fire pit surrounded by river rock. It was great for about a half an hour. The hollering was back. However, this time it was closer to home, literally. The sound seemed like it might be no more than 400 to 500 yards away across the river. It was really scary. It was not even hollering. It was more like a long siren going off. But the wife and I knew it was not a siren, as it did turn into a howling-like sound towards the end of it. My daughter and son ran over to us scared and pale-faced. My wife took them inside, and they stood there at the sliding glass door as she and I stood there listening for nearly 15 minutes as this thing kept screaming or whatever. It was on the move, too, and fast. It moved upstream almost a mile a minute, we could tell. Then, just like that, nothing. Only the sound of the fire and light breeze could be heard. Oh, and my son through the door asking, "What in the world was that?" I was not ready to say it was Bigfoot just yet, but my wife was, and she was obvious about it when she told our son it was one immediately. Yeah, the kids were a little bit frightened by the sound, but we both calmed their fears by letting them know and educate them about how to deal with wild animals and how wild animals usually tend to steer clear of people. It worked a bit, I suppose, to abate the fears they were showing, but that would only last a few weeks or so, and my wife would swear she saw one in the early morning. Now, my wife does a lot of sculpting. However, she is an artist and an artisan, which means she can do various types of art. One is watercolor paintings. She was never for the oil painting, just watercolors. It was getting nice as spring was giving way to an early summer, and the mornings were even surprisingly fair weathered for the Oregon coast, for the most part. Most people think the Pacific Northwest is always gloomy and foggy 365. Yes, it is a lot of the time, and I like it, but there are many days where it's absolutely sunny, warmer, and always beautiful. That morning was one of those perfect ones, but it would get weird looking, she said. It was a Saturday and the kids were home in bed still. Samantha, my wife, was up early. I was out of town looking at some property for a couple from back east who wanted to retire to the coast here and open a small B&B. So I was gone. Um, I think I was near Bandon, I recall. Here is what she said happened and what she observed. She had already begun painting. She had her easel, canvas or paper, and bagel and coffee next to her. Pretty typical artist setup, if you ask me, although I do not know much about the stuff. She was busy painting the scenery and a landscape piece when she is what she called them. It was while she was looking at painting the hillside across the river when she noticed some movement, unnatural movement. At first, she thought it was a huge stump or half-broken tree swaying in the wind, but there was no wind that morning. At least not the kind that can move something that large. After holding her hands above her brow line to shade her eyes, she was surprised to see a human-shaped large something or other swaying back and forth in between a couple of very large trees. It was massive. Tall, she said, at least 8 to 9 feet tall, and it was solid black color, or at least it was in the shadow of the trees and forest surrounding it. It was looking in her direction, and she knew it was not a person. Yes, it had a human shape to it, legs, arms, chest, and head that sat on the shoulders, she would say later, but it was a Bigfoot, she stated emphatically. I believe my wife, even before I saw it for myself. Seconds later, it was gone. She watched as it turned and walked off uphill and disappeared into the forest. She was excited but a little freaked out for sure. But I think my wife thinks these things are friendlier beasts than they are, so enthusiasm seemed to rule her day, and for the next few months going forward. Over the middle part of the summer, the hollering and even screaming continued, and one night I swear I heard something right outside the backyard, grunting. It was late one night, actually, early in the morning, about 3 to 4 a.m. for sure. My window was cracked open in the bedroom when I heard it. I got up after hearing it and even woke up Sam. Whatever it was, and she said it was a Bigfoot again, it took off. I heard the heavy footsteps as something in our backyard took off and sounded like it was heading down towards the river. There were other weird events, sounds, and whatnot through the rest of the summer, but when I saw what I saw that one summer day, well, it did change how I feel about living near the woods and forests of Oregon when you have children. That is for dang sure. Good golly, Miss Molly. Must have been the first week of August when I saw it, my son and I. As I said, I heard some grunts one night out in the yard. I did not see any footprints, but it was pretty dry out being summer, even on the coast, or a few miles or so to the east of it at least. We had heard more sounds at night as the summer marched along, too. We even started hearing strange whoops, whistles, and some other sound I can't even attribute an adjective, a noun, or a verb to. It was just plain old weird. But we heard them nonetheless. My wife had made some recordings back then on tape, and I would love to see if we can get that to you if we can find them. We do not want our names attached to it, to any of this yet, but if we can get them to you and share them. Anyways, It was the first week of August, like I said, and my son and I were going to do some fishing and on that Saturday morning and just hang out a bit together. I woke him up early and we had breakfast, basically some frosted flakes and juice. After that, we gathered up our supplies out of the garage and headed down to the river, basically out the backyard. The previous week had been pretty quiet, minus one night of whistles Sam and I heard while sitting out on the new back patio we built a month before, concrete and all. So I figured all was good. It was daytime anyways. We started fishing at daybreak. We were more like two chatty Cathys than fishermen, but we were dad and son having fun. But that fun ended abruptly. I know what some folks say, it is a friendly creature, something like that. Personally, I was scared, he was scared, and I was in protection mode immediately. No, it did not feel as though it was going to attack us, but it could have, and I got the sense it knew it could tear us apart, and it was not happy we were there either. My son was silent for a few seconds there as I kept rambling on about something. That is when he made me turn to see. That's what made me turn to see if he was all right. His face was as white as a ghost, and he was staring just to the southeast past me. I could not believe I never noticed it before, or even in my own peripherals while fishing. But there it was nonetheless. A Bigfoot. A huge, massive Bigfoot. It was huge. Its face was scary looking, and to me, well, it looked like a deformed monkey in the face except for the nose. It was flat but human-like. Its head was pointy and no neck could be seen. All pretty typical, I'd come to learn in books later. But then again, nothing is typical when you see something like this. It was hairy, full of hair except around its nose, eyes, and forehead to a point at the brow line. It was jet black, and the hair was long, like maybe 3 to 4 inches long as it blew about in the light breeze. That is how close we were. I could see the hair flowing. It was slightly hunched, and its arms were muscular, long, and I could see well enough to notice how long the fingers were, and they made the rest of that arm reach past its knees by at least 2 to 3 inches. Its chest was broad, and I believe it was a male, as I could not remember seeing any breasts that some have claimed to see. It was close enough to see its heavy brow line, but its eyes were either black as night, or it was still so early the shadow from the brow line would hide their color. But I could not see no whites at all, just deep, dark holes. I pulled my son next to me immediately. Between us and that Bigfoot was a deep and fast-flowing river. And while that thought made me feel comfortable as I could at that moment, it still gave me no reason to move fast. This thing was so tall I figured it could probably cross that river in just 4 to 5 strides anyways. All the while, being waist deep. It kept looking right at us, but it also looked around like it was looking for some cover, which it found to its right. It turned and took the weirdest stride I'd ever seen something take in my life towards a clump of tall underbrush and trees. It was as if it glided. I've heard the description as well, and they're right. It stopped again and turned back to look at us. Then, like a crackle of thunder, it started that all-familiar holler that at that moment seemed like a massive warning to my son and I. He was shaking in the waders, and so was I. We started to move back slowly towards the backyard. The scream must have woke up my wife, as all of a sudden I could hear her yelling for my son and I from the house. Even my daughter was yelling, we could tell. By the time we heard them and turned back to see this thing again, it was gone, or it was simply hiding. Either way, that was the first and last time I'd seen one. I have to say it was scary, and I know that this thing was warning us to back off. You could just sense it. Back in the saddle again. It was quite the experience, I have to say, and my wife, like any awesome wife, she was full of I told you so's, all morning and for weeks and months to come. And while she seemed almost excited with the visual and vocalization, I was a bit more apprehensive and decided to keep the kids from wandering off the property without one or both of us from then on. My wife agreed, but she became a researcher after that, while we lived there at least. Eventually we sold the place, moved to Depoe Bay. Yes, we told the new buyers of what we experienced, and instead of turning around and running out the door, it seemed they were enthused about the prospect of Bigfoot on their property, as my wife was. And it also seemed to be a deal clincher. But we moved, and I remember while the kids and I were not all that sad to leave Bigfoot behind, my wife was. She sat that last day, all day, doing a painting that sits in our living room today of the river, the woods behind it, and a shadowy figure leaning out from behind a tree if you look close enough. She named the painting Neighbor. Thanks, Rodney.